If you look at the charts, XRP today still lives in a world of low single digits. If you listen to the loudest voices online, you hear numbers like $100, $1,000, or more, with almost no explanation of how any of that would actually work in the real financial system. Somewhere between those two extremes is the real story. Because if XRP ever does support a triple-digit valuation in a sustainable way, it will not be because of one announcement or one ETF. It will be because a very specific set of pipes, products, and institutional behaviors quietly lock into place. There's a gap in how most people think about price. On one side, you have pure speculation, where numbers are thrown around based on feelings or old promises. On the other side, you have a kind of defeatist view that says, it's just another token, it will never matter. Neither lens asks the only question that really counts. What changes in the underlying plumbing of global finance when you move from a world where XRP is a speculative asset at around $2 to a world where it is a core liquidity instrument that could plausibly support a much higher unit price? This video lives in that gap. We are not going to talk about dates, we are not going to pretend one event flips a switch, and we are not going to treat market cap like a pot of gold that somehow has to be filled. Instead, we are going to walk through the actual structures that would have to be true for triple-digit XRP to make sense. The stack Ripple is building, how the XRP Ledger roots value, how real-time settlement changes liquidity requirements, how true float shrinks as institutions hold XRP for corridors, collateral, and reserves, and how all of that adds up over time. If you care about XRP, you do not need another promise. You need a map. By the end of this episode, you should have a clear picture of what that map looks like, and how close or far away we might be from that kind of world. Everything here is for educational and entertainment purposes only, not financial advice. Always do your own research before making any investment decisions. If clear, no hype crypto education helps you make sense of all this. Hit like and subscribe. It tells YouTube this series is worth showing to other newcomers, and it helps me keep building it for you. To understand how a price can move from a couple of dollars to something in the triple digits, you have to leave the world of speculation and enter the world of structural demand. Speculation asks, who will buy this next? Structural demand asks, who is required to hold this simply to operate their business? Those are very different worlds. Today, most XRP sits with retail holders, exchanges, market makers, and Ripple's Escrow. None of those holders are what drives long-term repricing. In a mature institutional system, XRP stops being a trading asset and becomes inventory. Banks, corporates, payment providers, ETF issuers, and even sovereign entities hold XRP not because of belief, but because their corridors, credit engines, liquidity buffers, and settlement systems cannot function without it. That shift happens gradually. ETF warehouses begin locking up supply for years at a time. Custodians move XRP into cold storage for institutional accounts. Corporate treasuries carry XRP the same way they carry FX reserves. RWA markets use it as collateral. And corridor-level real-time settlement forces banks and PSPs to maintain XRP buffers on balance sheet just to keep payments flowing. None of this is hype. It is the mechanical conversion of XRP from something people trade into something financial institutions must hold. Ripple's stack, regulated stablecoins, custody, prime brokerage, treasury rails, and a deterministic settlement ledger, creates the environment where that conversion becomes not just possible, but natural. If you strip away logos and marketing names, Ripple is assembling a very specific machine. At the top, you see things like Ripple Payments, which gives banks and payment companies a way to send money across borders without dealing with the full friction of correspondent banking. You see Ripple's regulated stablecoin, a dollar instrument issued under bank-grade supervision that can live natively on-chain. You see a custody arm, a prime brokerage business, and a treasury integration with providers like Treasury. Underneath those products sits the XRP Ledger, a settlement engine that closes ledgers in seconds, offers deterministic finality, and includes a built-in DEX and pathfinding logic that can route between multiple currencies and assets. That combination is not random. It lets Ripple offer institutions three things they cannot easily bolt together themselves: a regulated cash leg, a neutral bridge asset in XRP, and a programmable settlement layer that can connect corridors and assets across jurisdictions. In a $2 world, that architecture is still mostly potential. Some corridors are live, some clients are active, and some pilots are underway, but the majority of global flows still run on older rails. In any future where triple-digit XRP makes sense, that balance has changed. Ripple's stack has become one of the default ways regulated value moves through the system. The dollar stablecoin is used by banks and corporates as a normal settlement instrument. The custody and prime brokerage layers are trusted as part of institutional workflows. And the XRP ledger is quietly carrying more and more of the cross-asset routing in the background. The next piece of the puzzle is supply. Not the headline 100 billion number, but the amount of XRP that is actually liquid and available at any given moment. When people talk about price, they often point to total supply and market cap without asking a more practical question. How much XRP is truly for sale, and how much is effectively spoken for? In reality, large chunks of the supply are already constrained. Ripple's escrow accounts and corporate holdings are not active trading inventories in the way a retail wallet is. Over time, if Ripple continues to position XRP as a strategic asset for corridors and institutional products, more of that supply behaves like infrastructure capital rather than speculative float. On top of that, institutions running real-time settlement corridors must hold their own working inventories, pre-funded buffers sized to corridor limits, stress scenarios, and regulatory liquidity requirements. Then, you have other warehouses of XRP that are not immediately visible in a trading chart. Exchange cold storage, ETF, or ETP, products that hold XRP as underlying structured products and trusts, strategic reserves on corporate or even sovereign balance sheets, and on-chain positions parked in DeFi pools or pledged as collateral all remove units from day-to-day circulation. None of these buckets have to be total for the effect to be real. If effective liquid float compresses from a theoretical 100 billion into something in the single-digit billions, while demand from corridors and balance sheets climbs, price does not have much choice. It has to adjust. The way corridors themselves evolve is another crucial driver. Legacy cross-border systems like the Swift messaging network rely heavily on pre-funded accounts, netting windows, and end-of-day reconciliation. Liquidity is often sized around peak times in a very specific cycle. When a corridor moves onto real-time settlement rails, that logic changes. Payments can arrive at any moment, and the expectation from end users is that value moves in minutes, not days. In that world, treasurers do not immediately slash their buffers. They widen them. They would rather be overfunded in an always-on environment than discover in a busy hour that their corridor cannot clear flows. If those corridors are wired through Ripple's stack, part of that buffer is held in Ripple's regulated dollar stablecoin, and part is necessarily held in XRP itself, because real-time routing cannot depend on sourcing liquidity in the moment. The XRP inventory becomes operational infrastructure, not a speculative position. As more corridors turn on, and as their initial limits are tested and raised, the total amount of XRP that must sit ready inside those pipes grows. At first, maybe only a narrow set of remittance or trade flows rely on them. Over time, as confidence builds and reporting proves out, more volume is shifted from batch rails to real-time ones. Institutions do not move all at once, but they do move. And with each corridor and each limit increase, more XRP has to be held not as a bet, but as plumbing. In real-time environments, just-in-time sourcing collapses under liquidity stress. Only pre-positioned inventory keeps corridors open. That is structural demand, and it is exactly the kind of demand that can support higher price levels without depending on retail mood. Payments alone are not the end of the story. Once tokenized treasuries, money market funds, and other real-world assets start to live on or connect into the XRP ledger, you get a second layer of demand that does not care about cross-border remittances at all. It cares about portfolio construction, collateral, and credit. Imagine a corporate treasury that holds part of its working capital in a regulated on-chain dollar, uses tokenized treasuries for short-term yield, and occasionally posts collateral into DeFi-style credit platforms that supervisors actually approve. Every shift between those buckets is a settlement event. Some of those flows will be entirely inside the dollar environment. Others will require routing through XRP to reach certain venues, blockchains, or currencies. Now extend that picture to include lending protocols, synthetic instruments, and structured products that treat XRP itself as acceptable collateral. Each new design that locks XRP in as a balance sheet tool removes more units from the pool of readily tradable supply. Loans backed by XRP, yield strategies that pair XRP with stablecoins, and institutional DeFi integrations that use XRP as a core asset all narrow the float further. None of this has to dominate the market on day one. But in a world where tokenization is normal and DeFi's best ideas are absorbed into regulated infrastructure, XRP has multiple reasons to sit on the asset side of balance sheets, not just in trading accounts. When you put these strands together, a pattern starts to form. On one axis, Ripple's stack becomes more embedded. The regulated dollar leg is treated as institutional money. Custody and prime brokerage are wired into real clients, and the XRP Ledger carries more of the routing logic that used to sit in opaque correspondent chains. On another axis, effective float shrinks as XRP migrates into working inventories, collateral positions, ETF warehouses, and strategic reserves. On a third axis, real-time corridors and tokenized assets increase the number of situations where having XRP on hand is the simplest way to keep operations smooth. None of this guarantees a specific number. Markets still have cycles, corrections, and periods where price overshoots or undershoots what the fundamentals suggest. But if you imagine a world where the majority of those conditions are true, where Ripple's stack is one of the backbone options for global settlement, where true liquid float is measured in low billions rather than the full headline supply, and where XRP is normal collateral and routing inventory for banks, corporates, and platforms, then a $100 unit price is no longer a fantasy. It is one possible equilibrium in a system that simply needs a more valuable unit to do its job. Because the same corridor volume requires fewer tokens at higher valuations, higher XRP price actually reduces friction and increases efficiency. A counterintuitive but important point for settlement networks. The key point is that the path from around $2 to $100 is not a straight line and not an overnight event. It is a staircase built from corridors coming online, regulatory regimes maturing, tokenized assets going mainstream, and risk committees getting comfortable treating both Ripple's stable dollar and XRP as part of their standard toolkit. At each step, more XRP is absorbed into roles where selling it would break something operational. That is how a speculative asset becomes a piece of infrastructure. And that is the kind of transformation that can justify triple-digit valuations without ever promising that they must arrive. If you zoom back out, the disconnect that started this conversation becomes clearer. Most people looking at XRP see either a flat chart that refuses to cooperate with their hopes or a set of wild claims about imminent explosions. Very few look at the slow, methodical build-out of settlement rails, regulatory positioning, and liquidity architecture, and ask what those choices imply for price over a decade or more. The future where XRP trades at $100 is not guaranteed, but it is also not just a dream. It is a scenario that rests on real-world shifts we can already see and outline. central banks exploring digital money on Ripple's technology, financial centers recognizing Ripple's stablecoin as institutional grade, banks and corporates plugging into real-time corridors, and capital markets experimenting with tokenized assets and regulated DeFi that need neutral bridges underneath. As those pieces light up, the story that price tells starts to look less like speculation and more like a reflection of infrastructure that actually matters. For you as a viewer, the most useful question is no longer, will it go to this number? But, is the system moving in the direction that would require a more valuable unit to function? That question keeps you grounded. It forces you to watch the rails, the corridors, the regulatory approvals, and the product launches instead of the noise. And it aligns your attention with the institutions who will quietly decide which assets end up as the default plumbing in the next phase of global finance. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive. This channel is for educational and entertainment purposes only, and is not financial advice. Always do your own research and keep the discussion respectful. If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking, subscribing, leaving a comment, or sharing it with a friend.